Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name's Mark Walker and we're going to look at some patches. As nerdy as that sounds, I'm quite excited. As always, you can save yourself 5% on your eShop credit if you're interested over at switchup.gg using code SwitchUp and we get a little kickback. Hi everyone and welcome back to SwitchUp and to what you probably know is my favourite series on the channel where we look at some games that have been patched up. Now, I do have a bit of a treat for you. Not only do we have our sports story patch, but guess what else saw a patch today? Yep, Alan Wake has been patched. As well as this, we're going to do updates of Tinykin, Harvestella, Black Legend, and Bear and Breakfast. Have they been all patched up? Well, let's find out. Let's start with Tinykin. I absolutely loved this game when I reviewed it. It has very much a Pikmin quality to it, and it takes place in several rooms of a large house. Now, unfortunately, it had some performance issues in terms of dropped frame rates. It was only really in some of the larger rooms, and most of the other areas were fine. Overall, the game was still incredible, and I highly recommend it. But when we jump over to the patch, well, unfortunately, patch 1.1.0 hasn't really done much to mitigate the frame drops in those larger rooms. What I will say though is that the image quality has seen a slight improvement. These environments always look lovely, but they look that little bit crisper than they did before. The frame rate doesn't drop below 25, but I would like to see them work a little bit more to get this completely locked out. All of that being said, I would still highly recommend this game. It's incredibly fun and will put a big smile on your face as you slide around on your soap. Then we have Harvestella. This is now on version 1.0.2. One of the hardest things with any of these games is getting back to a point where you experienced your main issues, and for me it was always around that farm area. You could get it down to about 20, 23, 24 frames per second. I would say it's slightly improved here. Generally now we have 27 to 30 frames per second in this space. It's still not perfect, but it's definitely mildly improved. Image quality remains mostly the same, as do the load times, which are fine, but it's another that could use a little more work to get it completely locked. Still, it is nice to see developers going back and actually working on these games. Where patch notes are available, I will also use those, but unfortunately these two just don't have any. Then on to Black Legend. It's been literally years since I first reviewed this, and I was quite scathing. I love the concept from the developer of making, and I quote, the Dark Souls of turn-based strategy games, but it had so many bugs it wasn't even funny. Now, upon booting up this new version, I could see straight away the huge improvements over the original visuals, as well as the feel of the controls. Those are definitely better. Performance, again, is improved as well, and some of the camera clipping has been fixed. Now, there are extensive patch notes for the PC version, but not for the Switch, and this has had a patch quite recently. I know there were lots of issues related to memory and fixing the crashes, but guess what? I hit a crash very quickly, and that was me done with that. I can't recommend it if it's still crashing, so unfortunately Black Legend, you had a chance. Maybe I'll give you one more. It's annoying because it is a fun game, and I might have just been very unlucky, but to crash within 20 minutes, yeah, sad times. Then we have Bear and Breakfast. Now this is a bit more like it. The original release, I loved it. Incredible game. I have real problems with the control scheme they opted for, but you could gradually work it out. Unfortunately, it had a lot of crashing issues. There were some people that were literally getting memory bugs and crashing over and over again. Now, Bear and Breakfast is up to version 1.7.1. Initially, the 1.4 release was trying to target those memory issues, but again, they persisted for a lot of players. This 1.7.1 release includes a load of stuff, so the chief among them should be those crashes. For most of you now, you shouldn't experience repeated or even any crashes. Again, It's strange how these issues affect some and not others. I never had any issues with crashing, but judging by the patch notes, they've done everything they can to try and fix those, so do let me know in the comments if you experience any. Performance is generally fine. There is a little fluctuation here, but it's generally quite high. In fact, I believe they locked it out at 40 FPS. They've tweaked the way you place items as well to try and avoid some potential soft locks, as well as soft locks that did affect some menus. You can also now save within the pause menu screen, which is a nice touch, and they added in, if you missed it, a load of free winter content, including new furniture and items, as well as lots of little bug fixes, which is always good to see. Now, I love Bear and Breakfast. It's incredible. I was hoping that they would include some new control options. The way that you build rooms just feels a little clunky. It works well enough once you've got to grips with it, but it will take some time to master. Then we have Sports Story, which is on version 1.0.4. Now, there was a lot of controversy around this one when it released, mainly because the developers included a secret room, which essentially said that they were having to crunch to get the game finished. Then there was a bit of controversy stating that once this patch released, that was gone. Well, that's not the case. You can still access the secret room, but they've changed the dialogue and made it basically sound like everything's fine. Yeah, that's weird, isn't it? So I've put on my patch notes, reassuring dialogue. Yeah, I would have suggested they spent more time actually fixing the game. Now, it had some fluctuating frame rate issues which really were a pain, particularly when you're playing rounds of golf. Those frame rates would change all over the place. I didn't actually realise this one targets 60 FPS, and it can hit that a lot of the time, but unfortunately those issues persist. The frame rate will suddenly drop down when you reach the edges, or at certain other random times, you'll find that suddenly the movement increases massively, and it just feels really odd. Those big lag issues do remain. They're not as bad as they were. I think it's fair to say that they have done some patchwork for the performance, but they're still there enough to make it just not feel quite finished yet. That's not really the biggest issue though. Do you remember all of the issues in terms of trigger points not activating? Well, look, they fixed a ton of them. There were quests that you would go on and those trigger points would essentially just not work, and you'd be stood there in these like awkward moments staring at the quest giver, and he'd be staring back at you, and you'd both be expecting something to happen and it wouldn't. Well, loads of those have been fixed, but not all of them. Even some of the little side quests, you'll go back to old areas and it will be acting as if you've never done the missions, or you'll play a mini game in the tennis area and it won't get your tennis racket out. Or if you remember the little babies that you have to look after at one point, well, they're still glitching so that they can see, well, essentially you can see yourself through them, and vice versa. Now, in their defense, yes, as I said before, tons and tons and tons of bug fixes, but does it feel finished? Not just yet. They're on the right track, but it's more the game as a whole. I think they probably should have just done Golf Story too. Still, for a bit of multiplayer, 1 to 4 people just playing the courses, it is quite fun. Cue dramatic music. That takes us on to Alan Wake, which, despite the absolute radio silence, has finally seen a patch, taking it from 1.0.0, wait for it, to 1.0.1. Now, where do we begin with this one? It shadow dropped out of nowhere, and the performance was bad. In docked mode, the performance would constantly fluctuate. You could get it down to 15 frames per second in some areas. It was embarrassing, in honesty. In handheld, it wasn't quite as bad, and strangely, that was definitely the preferred way to play. Docked seemed to have some real frame pacing issues, and then there were the Vaseline-like visuals. How about patch 1.0.1 then? Well, let's start with frame rates. Where they once dropped below 15 frames per second, now I can't get them to move at all. They are locked out 30 FPS. It's like the silkiest of silk, and I know 30 FPS isn't 60 FPS, but when the frame pacing is perfect, it can feel really good. And I've got to say, fair play to the developers. This is feeling silky smooth when playing in dock docked or handheld now. They've really sorted out those frame pacing issues. Visually, has it improved? Well, we can look at it and I'm not so sure. Maybe it's seen some slight improvements. Some of the aliasing didn't look as bad. I didn't see some artifacts that were there previously in the distance, but I could just be wanting to see things. But even if it's had the slightest improvement, the fact that they have completely fixed the performance for me is the biggest issue, and I am well happy with that. As you can see, performance is just flawless. When we jump over to handheld, which we're going to do because I think it's also worth seeing if that's slightly improved, again, it's just perfect in handheld now. No, the Vaseline isn't perfect, but again, it's a dark game and one that really, you're not going to be stood pixel peeping when you're running through the dark with the torch. Some of the lighting effects seem to have been improved as well. One thing I didn't notice when I first played it, maybe it was because I was using non-official Joy-Con, is the fact that it has HD rumble for every footstep that you take, and that's actually quite nice. It certainly heightens the suspense when you're creeping along through the dark. So we are up to perfect performance with a mild coating of Vaseline on each eye. Fair play to them for working away in the quiet and not responding to anyone on Twitter or anywhere else, and then just dropping a much improved version. As always, we do try and go back and visit any games that have been patched up. Please do let me know in the comments if there are any games that you want me to visit. I know I still haven't done the revisit video for Soldiers. I have actually played and recorded a lot of that, but I just need to get a bit further, and weirdly on a couple of saves, just get to some of the locations that I was at previously, both those that are close to the start and those that are close to the end. It's surprisingly difficult to make your way back, but I will get there eventually. Thanks to all of you that enjoy the content. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I certainly have. And as always, if you enjoy the content, then do consider sticking around. And a big thanks to our Patreons and our members and all of you lot for all things Switch all the time. Keep it Switch up. Cheers, guys. See ya!
Alan, listen to me.